Welcome. The today topic is Angular 6 component. So the component is a basic building block to build an Angular application. The component the component control the screen patch called a view. So the screen is a HTML page and HTML page consists of set of DOM elements. The screen divided into the screen patches. So each screen patch will have a set of DOM elements. Those DOM elements are grouped as a view, and that view is associated with a component. The component is a class. Since we develop applications in TypeScript language, the component is a class is internally converts that TypeScript class as a JavaScript function. So the component is a class. The class will have a data and application logic which controls the view. So the component applies the application logic on the data, and that data is rendered to the views after applying the application logic. So every component is with one template or view. We call it as a template. The term is called is it as a template, and that template will have a set of DOM elements. Those elements are controlled by the component. So here it is that any class is decorated with a component that we call that class as a component. So the class which is decorated with the components in our application, those classes are called component. So as I said earlier, the component must associated with one view, and that view represents the one screen patch in the screen. So that view we call it as a template. So that HTML file has to be associated with the component. That is done through the metadata of the component. See that here the template URL, we are mapping that hero list component.html. That HTML has a set of DOM elements, and that HTML instance is associated with this hero list component. So this class is associated with one template, and that template has the set of div elements. Those elements are controlled by this component. Then there is, if we want to refer this component, if we want insert this piece of that HTML in any other HTML, then that we refer this component with a CSS selector name. Here the selector name is app hero list. So that selector name. So we refer this component in HTML page by selector name. So when they refer with the selector name, it inserts this HTML in the parent HTML, and that HTML we call it as a view, and that view is associated with the component. And another metadata of this component is providers. If component has dependency on any services that need to be provided in the providers metadata, those services will be injected into this component while Angular framework instantiates this component. When Angular framework sees that selector name in any HTML page and it loads, it instantiates the component and then it associate the instance of that component HTML, that is called template, and also it injects the services declared in the provider's metadata and provides to that component. So some basic terminologies associated with this component, that is the view. So template controls the patch of the screen called view. The screen patch is set of div elements that is under the view. That view is associated with component. So view is basically the component hosts the view. The template, as I said, as I was mentioning from the beginning, the template is a patch of that HTML and with the Angular directives. So template is a HTML page, but with in Angular with Angular directives. This directives modifies the attributes or structure of the div elements of the HTML. So template is a form of HTML associated with the component, and that HTML with the Angular directives, those directives modifies the attributes of that HTML and bind to the data of the component. So the component can define view hierarchy and embedded views. So as the component hosts the view, and view consists of div elements, and also along with the div elements, the view can have a child component. The child component again hosts the view, and the view have a set of div elements, and those elements are controlled by the child component. So and the child can have a one more child component. So the Angular component as a view hierarchy, and view hierarchy will have a child components and child have a another child component. So those components, each component hosts the view and controlled by respective component. So data binding. So the main feature of this component is the data binding. So the component controls the view, and component controls the view through the properties of the component and properties and methods of the component. So data binding. So the component binds the component properties to the views properties through Angular directives. So one of the major directive which is binds the data to the component and view, that is called ng model. ng model, if any element, the element which is has a directive ng model, that when there is a change in the view, that data, the view, that change data is bind to the components data. So when there is change in the view, that change the data in component. So when any element has the directive with the banana box of ng model, it's a two-way binding. So when the component applies the application logic and then modifies the data, that modified data will be set on that view. So that is So when user enters the data on the view, that data is set on to the properties of the component. So in both ways. So that is two-way binding. So when DOM element with the ng model banana box, it is two-way binding, and with the brackets of ng model, that is one-way binding. So as another way of data binding is that, so when there is events on the on click, for example on click event, so that event we can trigger with, it calls the methods of the component, and the methods component through the application logic and change the data, and that data is set on the views. So we call it as that is event binding. So components has a two type of bindings. One is a property binding, another is event binding. The property binding is that it binds the data to the DOM elements, and event binding on the HTML events, it calls the methods, and the methods will go through the business logic, and that logic changes modifies the data, and that data is set onto the view by two-way data binding. So the component, so this is Angular creates the updates, destroys the component as user moves through the application. Loading the component view onto the page is a series of events. The first, it loads the HTML page static elements, then it binds the properties to the component properties, and then it loads the child component, and then it binds the child component properties. So there is a series of Angular framework triggers the series of events to load a page. So at each event we can take an action on taken action at each event. So that is through lifecycle hooks. At each event, component gets the control by lifecycle hooks, so that we can act on those events and act on those data changes. So that is through lifecycle hooks. So lifecycle hooks is optional, and we can implement those interfaces, and Angular framework calls those methods at that events are triggered. So Angular app can take action at each event through lifecycle hooks. So this is about the component. The component is a class which controls the view, that we call as a screen patch. One screen patch will be a set of DOM elements. That's the component hosts that view and controls the view. So component will have a data and application logic, and component renders the data after applying application logic to the views. So this is all about components, and thank you.